In the spring of 2025, a long simmering trade dispute between the United States and Canada erupted into a full-blown crisis, sending shockwaves across North America. What began as a series of heated negotiations over tariffs and trade imbalances quickly escalated, drawing in politicians, business leaders, and everyday citizens on both sides of the border. At the heart of this conflict was an unlikely protagonist, the Alaska Highway. This legendary road, stretching over 1,300 miles through some of the continent's most rugged terrain, suddenly found itself at the center of an international standoff. The Alaska Highway, once celebrated as a marvel of engineering and a symbol of cross-border unity, was now the focal point of a bitter dispute. Decades ago, the highway's construction was hailed as a triumph of cooperation during World War II, a lifeline connecting Alaska to the rest of the United States through Canadian soil. But now, that same route had become a flashpoint, its legacy overshadowed by political tension and economic uncertainty. The situation intensified when the U.S. threatened to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, a move that sent shockwaves through both economies. In retaliation, Canada targeted the Alaska Highway, introducing new tolls, restrictions, and regulations that threatened to choke off the vital land route to Alaska. Canadian officials justified these measures by citing environmental concerns and the rights of Indigenous communities whose lands the highway traverses. Protesters lined the roads, holding signs demanding justice and protection for their land, while government spokespeople insisted the new policies were about more than just trade, they were about sovereignty and respect. For generations, the Alaska Highway had been a taken-for-granted link, a quiet artery pulsing with the movement of people and goods. Now, it was transformed into a battleground, its once busy lanes eerily quiet as uncertainty gripped the region. For Americans, especially those living in Alaska, the idea of restricted access to their own state was unthinkable. Families worried about being cut off from essential supplies, while business owners feared for their livelihoods. The sense of isolation grew with each passing day, as the reality of the dispute set in. The crisis exposed a harsh truth: Alaska's unique vulnerability. Separated from the lower 48 by more than 500 miles of Canadian territory, the state's connection to the rest of the country depended entirely on the goodwill of its northern neighbor. As headlines grew more alarming, daily life for thousands was thrown into chaos. Long lines formed at border crossings, grocery store shelves emptied, and travelers found themselves stranded at remote rest stops, unsure when, or if, they would be able to continue their journeys. The world's longest undefended border, once a symbol of peace and trust, was suddenly under unprecedented strain. The invisible line that had united two nations for generations now threatened to divide them. The Alaska Highway, which had stood for decades as a testament to cooperation and shared purpose, now symbolized a fractured alliance. The faded welcome signs at the border seemed to echo the uncertainty and mistrust that had taken hold. As storm clouds gathered over the highway, the path forward for these two nations had never looked more uncertain. The future of the Alaska Highway, and the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, hung in the balance, with the world watching to see what would happen next. Canada's restrictions weren't about isolation or closing itself off from its southern neighbor. Instead, they were a carefully measured response, designed to address a rapidly escalating economic threat. Canadian officials recognized that simply reacting emotionally or with blanket bans would only worsen the situation. Instead, they chose a path that balanced firmness with diplomacy, signaling to both domestic and international audiences that Canada was prepared to defend its interests with precision. These new restrictions were a strategic defense against the threatened U.S. tariffs, which had the potential to disrupt vital trade flows and harm Canadian industries. By targeting specific sectors and goods, Canada aimed to minimize collateral damage while sending a clear message to Washington. Any attempt to undermine Canadian prosperity would be met with a thoughtful, targeted response. Ottawa and provincial leaders saw the Alaska Corridor as their best leverage, framing new rules as environmental and Indigenous rights measures. This approach allowed them to justify their actions on the world stage, emphasizing Canada's commitment to sustainability and reconciliation, while also using these justifications as a shield against accusations of protectionism. By calling it a regulatory recalibration, Canada asserted its legal authority while applying pressure on the US. The term itself was chosen to highlight that these were not arbitrary or punitive measures, but rather a lawful adjustment of existing regulations in response to changing circumstances. The timing was no accident. Canadian officials acted swiftly, implementing these measures just as US tariff threats reached a critical point. This careful coordination demonstrated that Canada was not only aware of the stakes, but also capable of acting decisively when its economic security was at risk. These were real policy issues, environmental protection, indigenous rights, and regulatory oversight, but their sudden enforcement was a clear response to American threats. The government wanted to show that it could pivot quickly, using legitimate policy tools to defend national interests. Experts like Dr. Jennifer Collins confirmed the moves were legal, not a declaration of trade war. She and other analysts pointed out that Canada's actions fell well within international law, and that the country was simply exercising its right to protect its own economy. Trudeau and premiers insisted their goal was to protect Canadian interests, not punish Alaskans. They emphasized that the measures were temporary and reversible should the US reconsider its aggressive stance. The message to Washington was unmistakable. Canada would not be a passive victim of US protectionism. Instead, it would stand firm, using every tool at its disposal to ensure its voice was heard and its economy protected. Donald Trump's response was immediate and incendiary, turning the dispute into a rallying cry. He accused Trudeau of weakness and cast Canada as a hostile gatekeeper, fueling his America First campaign. At rallies, Trump declared, "They're trying to cut off Alaska. Not on my watch." He hinted at extreme retaliation, even suggesting military action or annexation, escalating tensions. Trump's framing made compromise difficult, keeping the dispute in the national spotlight. The conflict became a test of national pride, with Trump positioning himself as America's defender. British Columbia led Canada's response with the Economic Stabilisation Tariff Response Act. The law empowered the province to impose tolls on U.S. commercial vehicles heading to Alaska and to favor Canadian products in government procurement. Liquor stores stopped selling products from Republican-led states, including Alaska. The act was temporary, set to expire in 2027, and framed as a defensive measure. By acting provincially, BC created a buffer for Ottawa and targeted the economic pain. The legislation signaled unity among Canadian provinces and readiness to defend national interests. A provincial highway became the front line of international trade policy. British Columbia's actions sparked a coordinated response across Canada. Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the US, showing even conservative premiers were on board. Yukon mirrored BC's restrictions, halting US product purchases and limiting contracts for American businesses. The entire land bridge to Alaska became a new economic battleground. Provincial solidarity complicated any US strategy to divide and negotiate separately. The message, a tariff war, would trigger cascading countermeasures across Canada. The stakes for US policymakers had never been higher. For Alaskans, the dispute was personal, a threat to daily life and economic stability. The highway is vital for fresh produce, urgent supplies, and military families, goods that can't wait for a barge. New tolls meant higher prices and empty shelves, with costs passed directly to consumers. Seasonal workers and families faced uncertainty and new expenses. The sense of isolation deepened, fueling frustration and anxiety. Alaskans, caught in the middle, demanded action from their leaders. The dispute dominated local news, uniting residents in a call for resolution. The human cost of the diplomatic conflict was impossible to ignore. The U.S. response split between public threats and quiet diplomacy. Alaska's Senator Dan Sullivan pushed to waive the Passenger Vessel Services Act, threatening BC's lucrative cruise industry. A PVSA waiver would let cruise ships bypass Canadian ports, costing BC hundreds of millions. Meanwhile, the State Department pursued high-level talks with Ottawa, seeking de-escalation. Public statements were measured, avoiding Trump's inflammatory rhetoric. The U.S. balanced pressure from Alaska with the need to preserve the broader relationship. The PVSA threat became a key bargaining chip. The situation demanded a delicate balance between strength and negotiation. The outcome would shape the future of U.S.-Canada ties. Canada firmly asserted its legal right to regulate its own territory. No treaty guarantees the U.S. toll-free access to the Alaska Highway. The 1942 agreement was military, not a permanent civilian guarantee. Canada's new policies, tolls, environmental reviews, indigenous consultations, are standard exercises of sovereignty. Legal experts confirmed Canada's position. The U.S. had no legal claim, only economic leverage. Canada's stance access is a courtesy, not a right, and depends on fair bilateral relations. The legal high ground forced the U.S. to negotiate, not litigate. By late June 2025, the Alaska Highway dispute remained unresolved, casting a long shadow over the once strong relationship between the United States and Canada. What began as a disagreement over transit rights and tariffs had grown into a complex standoff, with both sides wary of making the first move. The uncertainty was felt not just in government offices but also by ordinary people living along the border, who suddenly found their daily routines disrupted and their futures unclear. Behind closed doors, quiet diplomatic talks offered a glimmer of hope. Negotiators explored the possibility of a compromise, perhaps a mutual agreement to drop tariffs in exchange for easing travel and trade restrictions. Both governments understood the stakes. A breakthrough could restore confidence and prevent further economic pain, while failure might deepen the rift for years to come. But the risk of escalation was real. Each new measure, whether a tariff, a restriction, or a retaliatory policy, threatened to trigger a chain reaction. Businesses on both sides of the border braced for impact, as supply chains slowed and shelves in some communities began to empty. Factories faced production delays, and workers worried about their jobs. The conflict exposed Alaska's unique vulnerability. For many Alaskans, the highway was a lifeline, connecting them to essential goods and services. Now, with the border in question, people began to see the region, and the border itself, in a new light, as a place of uncertainty rather than simple passage. Both nations now recognize the Alaska Highway as a potential choke point, a strategic asset that could be used as leverage in negotiations. What was once a routine crossing had become a symbol of tension, with increased inspections and long lines at checkpoints. The trust that once defined the relationship between the U.S. and Canada was shaken. Decades of cooperation and shared values seemed fragile in the face of political and economic pressures. Communities that once celebrated their cross-border ties now faced uncertainty and suspicion. The best-case scenario was clear: a swift diplomatic fix, with both sides making concessions and reaffirming their commitment to partnership. Such an outcome would not only restore trade and travel but also send a powerful message about the resilience of North American unity. The worst-case scenario, however, loomed large: a prolonged trade war, deepening animosity, and a lasting chill in relations. Protests erupted at border crossings, and the economic fallout threatened to spread far beyond the highway itself. The Alaska Highway, once a proud symbol of unity and cooperation, now stands as a stark reminder of how quickly alliances can fracture. As both nations look to the uncertain road ahead, the choices they make will shape the future of North American relations for years to come.